The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, tucked between a credit card offer and a flyer for a grocery store closing sale. And Claire Bennett almost threw it away without opening it, assuming, from the unfamiliar law firm's letterhead visible through the envelope's window, that it was some manner of solicitation or scam targeting her name from a mailing list she'd never consented to join. She opened it only because something in the weight of the paper, the evident formality of its printing, gave her pause at the last moment before she consigned it to the recycling bin alongside the rest of that day's junk mail. "Dear Ms. Bennett," the letter began, in the careful, formal language of a law office accustomed to delivering news that required precisely calibrated professional distance. "We are writing to inform you that you have been named sole beneficiary in the estate of Mr. Walter Kessler, who passed away on the 14th of February of this year. Per the terms of Mr. Kessler's will, you are to inherit the entirety of his property, located at 1147 Ridgeline Trail, including the primary residence, all contained belongings, and the surrounding 12 acres of land. We would ask that you contact our office at your earliest convenience to begin the process of formally transferring this inheritance." Claire read the letter 3 times before she fully trusted that she had understood it correctly, and then sat at her kitchen table for the better part of an hour, the letter held loosely in her hands, trying to place the name Walter Kessler against any memory she could summon from 31 years of a life that had, admittedly, involved considerable relocation and considerable loss, but that she was nonetheless quite certain had never included any acquaintance, however distant, with a man by that name. She called the law office the following morning, expecting, with the particular weary skepticism of a modern person accustomed to identity theft and elaborate scams targeting exactly the kind of unexpected windfall the letter described, that some manner of clerical error or fraudulent scheme would quickly reveal itself once she pressed for actual details. Instead, she found herself speaking with an attorney named Patricia Vance, whose careful professional patience, through Claire's considerable skepticism, only deepened her confusion rather than resolving it. "I understand this must feel entirely unexpected," Vance told her, once Claire had explained somewhat awkwardly that she genuinely had no memory of ever meeting anyone named Walter Kessler. "But I can assure you the will is entirely legitimate, properly executed and witnessed some 6 years ago, and has been reviewed by our office to confirm its validity following Mr. Kessler's passing. He named you, specifically and by full legal name, including your correct date of birth and social security number for identification purposes, as his sole beneficiary. I confess I do not know the nature of your connection to him, as Mr. Kessler was, from what I understand, a somewhat private man who did not discuss the reasoning behind his estate planning decisions with our office, beyond what was strictly necessary for the will's proper legal execution." "He knew my social security number," Claire repeated slowly, a chill working its way through her that had nothing to do with the cold March morning outside her kitchen window. "How would a man I've never met have access to that kind of information?" "I cannot answer that with any certainty," Vance admitted, "but I can tell you that Mr. Kessler left, alongside his property, a personal journal that he specifically instructed our office to deliver to you, unopened, prior to any other communication regarding the estate. He was quite particular about this instruction, Ms. Bennett. The journal was to reach you before you visited the property itself, and before any other explanation of his reasoning was offered by our office or by any other party who might claim to know his intentions. I confess I found the instructions somewhat unusual, but it was his explicit wish, clearly documented, and I have honored it accordingly." The journal arrived by careful, insured courier 3 days later, a thick, worn, leather-bound volume that showed considerable evidence of years of regular use. Its cover soft and cracked from handling, its pages, when Claire finally worked up the nerve to open it that evening, filled with a small, careful handwriting that covered what appeared to be a span of many years of consistent, dedicated entries. She began reading that same night, sitting alone at her kitchen table, with a cup of tea gone cold beside her, and found herself, within the first several pages, confronting a story considerably more personal and considerably stranger than she had allowed herself to anticipate from the law office's careful, professional distance. "I do not know if you will ever read this," the journal's opening entry began, dated nearly 15 years earlier, "but I have decided, after considerable thought, that I owe you an accounting of my reasons, whenever the day comes that circumstance finally brings this journal into your hands. My name is Walter Kessler, and though we have never met, and though you almost certainly do not know my name, I have spent a great many years thinking of you, and a great many more years working to ensure that if the worst ever came to pass in your own life, you would have somewhere to turn that I had prepared carefully and quietly, without ever once making my presence known to you directly." Claire's hands trembled slightly as she turned the page, some instinct warning her, even before she read further, that whatever explanation followed would reshape her understanding of her own history in ways she was not yet prepared for. "I served, many years ago, alongside your father, Michael Bennett, during our time in the military together. We were close, closer than most brothers, the particular closeness that combat and shared hardship sometimes forges between men who might otherwise never have crossed paths in ordinary civilian life. Your father saved my life on more than one occasion during those difficult years, and I have never, in all the decades since, found any way to properly repay what I owed him for that." Claire sat back in her chair, understanding beginning to take shape with a clarity that brought its own considerable disorientation. Her father, Michael Bennett, had died when she was 6 years old, killed in an accident she had always understood to be work-related, the details of which her mother had never discussed in any great depth before her own death some 8 years later, left Claire, at 14, an orphan raised thereafter by an aunt whose own limited patience and limited affection had shaped Claire's adult life in ways she had spent considerable therapy working through across her 20s. She had never once heard her father's military service mentioned in any detail. She had not known, reading this journal's careful opening pages, that her father had served alongside anyone at all, let alone a man whose gratitude and guilt over some unexplained debt had apparently shaped the entirety of a stranger's life for decades afterward. "Your father died," the journal continued, "not in the accident your mother told you about, if indeed she ever told you the full truth of it at all. He died protecting a mission that our unit was never meant to discuss beyond the strictest official channels, a mission that I survived only because of choices he made in its final, chaotic minutes that I have spent every day since trying to prove myself worthy of. I could not attend his funeral. I could not properly explain to your mother, in the aftermath, exactly what had happened or why. The circumstances of his death were classified in ways that prevented any of us who served alongside him from offering the kind of honest account his family deserved. And I have carried the weight of that silence for every year since, understanding that whatever grief your mother and you experienced in the years following his death was made considerably worse by an absence of truth that I, more than anyone still living, might have been able to provide, had circumstance and military protocol permitted it." Claire read on through that first night, working through journal entries that spanned years of careful, quiet observation. Walter Kessler, it became increasingly clear across the following pages, had spent decades watching over her from a careful, deliberate distance. Learning of her mother's death, when Claire was 14, through channels the journal did not fully specify. Watching her progress through the foster and extended family arrangements that followed, quietly ensuring, through anonymous scholarship applications and carefully arranged financial assistance, that Claire had always assumed came from legitimate need-based programs, that she never faced the kind of desperate hardship that might have derailed her education or her early adult independence. "I built this cabin," one entry read, dated some 10 years earlier, "specifically with you in mind, though I never expected, when I began the work, that I would spend a full decade of careful preparation before circumstance finally brought me to write this explanation down properly. I wanted you to have somewhere to turn, should the world ever leave you without resources or family to rely upon, that came not from charity or pity, but from a debt I had spent my entire adult life trying, inadequately, to repay. Your father gave me the remainder of my life, at the cost of his own. I could not save him. I could not properly grieve alongside your family in the aftermath. But I could, across the years that followed, work quietly to ensure that his daughter never wanted for the kind of security a father's continued presence might otherwise have provided. Claire closed the journal sometime past midnight, her tea long gone cold, her understanding of her own history fundamentally reshaped by a stranger's careful, decades-long devotion to a debt she had never known existed. She sat for a long while in the quiet of her kitchen, working through the particular vertigo of learning that a man she had never consciously met had, in some very real sense, shaped the entire trajectory of her adult life through careful, invisible intervention she had never once suspected. She drove to the cabin 3 days later, taking leave from the modest office job that had, until this letter's arrival, represented the entirety of her carefully ordinary adult existence. Understanding that whatever additional explanation the journal's remaining pages held, she needed to see, with her own eyes, the physical place a stranger's decades of guilt and gratitude had built specifically for a day he had apparently long anticipated might eventually come. The drive to Ridgeline Trail took the better part of 4 hours, the final stretch climbing through increasingly remote mountain terrain along a road that grew progressively narrower and less maintained the further Claire traveled from the last small town she had passed through nearly an hour earlier, until she began to genuinely wonder whether her GPS had somehow led her astray into terrain no cabin could reasonably be expected to occupy. The cabin itself, when she finally arrived, proved considerably more substantial than she had allowed herself to expect from the journal's modest description. A solid, well-constructed 2-story structure set into a clearing that offered a genuinely breathtaking view across the surrounding valley, built with evident craftsmanship and careful attention to detail that spoke, even to Claire's untrained eye, of a builder who had approached the work with considerably more care than simple practical necessity would have required. She let herself in with the key Patricia Vance's office had provided, and found the interior, much as the journal's earlier entries had prepared her to expect, meticulously organized and carefully maintained despite what she understood to be weeks since Walter Kessler's death, suggesting either that the property had been recently and carefully cleaned in preparation for her arrival, or that Kessler himself had maintained a standard of order throughout his final years that reflected the same careful, deliberate attention his journal's decades of entries had already demonstrated. She found the remainder of the journal, for the volume she had already read represented, she now understood, only the first of several such books Kessler had apparently kept across his years of careful preparation, arranged in a small study on the cabin's second floor, alongside a considerable library of books and what appeared to be an extensive collection of financial records and legal documents that Claire understood, even before she began properly examining them, likely pertained to the various forms of anonymous assistance the journal's earlier entries had already described. She spent that first evening at the cabin working through the second volume of Kessler's journal, finding within its pages a continued, careful account of years she had lived through without any awareness of the quiet observation and intervention that had apparently shaped considerably more of her adult path than she had previously understood. "I watched you graduate college," one entry read, dated some 7 years earlier, "from a respectful distance, standing at the very back of the ceremony where you would not have recognized me, had you happened to glance my way. I confess, I wept, watching you walk across that stage, understanding, in that moment, that whatever inadequate substitute my careful, distant assistance had provided across the preceding years, you had built something genuinely your own from it, a degree earned through your own considerable effort, a future your own hard work had properly secured, regardless of whatever quiet financial cushion I had arranged to ensure hardship never derailed your progress toward it. Claire found herself, reading these careful, decade-spanning entries, working through a complicated mixture of gratitude and unease that she suspected would take considerably longer than a single evening's reading to properly resolve. She understood, intellectually, the evident sincerity and evident care behind Kessler's decades of quiet devotion, understood the genuine debt of guilt and gratitude that had apparently driven a stranger to reshape his own entire life around ensuring her security. But she found herself also confronting, with growing discomfort, the particular strangeness of having been watched, however benevolently, across so many years of a life she had understood, until 3 days earlier, to be entirely her own private story. It was in the journal's later entries, dated across the final years before Kessler's death, that Claire finally found what she recognized as a fuller, more complete accounting of the exact circumstances surrounding her father's death. Details the earlier entries had only partially explained. Details that Kessler, it became clear, had waited to properly commit to writing until he had grown confident that whatever remaining classification restrictions had once prevented full disclosure had finally lapsed sufficiently to permit honest explanation. "Your father and I were part of a specialized unit," one entry explained, in considerably more careful detail than the earlier pages had provided. "Tasked with a mission whose full parameters I am still not entirely at liberty to describe, even now, decades removed from the events themselves. What I can tell you is that our unit was ambushed during what should have been a routine extraction, and that your father, recognizing before any of the rest of us fully understood the danger we faced, made the deliberate choice to draw enemy fire away from the remainder of our unit, buying us the time necessary to reach safety, at the cost of his own considerable exposure to that same danger. He did not die instantly. I was with him in his final hours, though military protocol at the time prevented me from ever properly explaining this to your family, and I have carried, across all the years since, both the guilt of having survived through his sacrifice, and the guilt of having been unable to offer your mother and yourself the honest account of his final hours that might have brought you some measure of proper closure, however painful that fuller truth might also have proven." Claire wept, reading this account, for a father she barely remembered, for a mother whose own grief, she now understood with considerably more clarity, had likely been compounded by exactly the kind of incomplete, officially sanitized explanation that had left both of them without the genuine understanding Kessler's journal now, decades later, finally provided. She spent the following several days at the cabin, working through the remainder of Kessler's careful journals and records, gradually piecing together not simply the story of her father's death and Kessler's decades of subsequent guilt and quiet devotion, but also, through the considerable financial records the study's careful filing revealed, the full extent of exactly how much of her adult life's apparent good fortune had actually traced back to Kessler's careful, anonymous intervention. Scholarship funds she had assumed came from legitimate need-based programs, an unexpected but genuinely welcome bonus at a critical early job that had allowed her to properly establish her independent finances during a period of considerable early career precarity. Even, she discovered with particular astonishment, careful behind-the-scenes intervention that had ensured a difficult landlord dispute during her mid-20s resolved considerably more favorably than her own limited resources at the time should reasonably have allowed. "He shaped my entire life," she said aloud, alone in the cabin's quiet study, working through the full accumulated weight of this discovery with an emotion she could not entirely categorize as gratitude or grief or something considerably more complicated, combining both. "Every difficult moment I thought I'd navigated entirely on my own, he was there, quietly, the whole time, making sure I never actually had to face the worst of it alone." It was on her 4th day at the cabin, working through a final section of Kessler's careful records that she had not yet properly examined, that Claire discovered a detail the journal's earlier entries had not fully prepared her to encounter. Evidence, in the form of careful correspondence and financial documentation, suggesting that Kessler's decades of quiet devotion had not been entirely without cost to his own life and relationships, that the guilt and purpose that had driven his careful, invisible presence in her own story had also, apparently, prevented him from ever building the kind of independent life and relationships that might otherwise have offered him genuine companionship. Across the many isolated years his devotion to her welfare had ultimately required. The correspondence Claire found, tucked into a careful folder near the back of the study's considerable filing system, revealed a man who had, in the decades following her father's death, deliberately structured his entire adult existence around the quiet, anonymous mission of ensuring her security, at a cost to his own personal life that the earlier journal entries had never fully acknowledged. A series of letters, exchanged across nearly 15 years with a woman named Dorothy Fairweather, whose own careful correspondence suggested a relationship that had, at various points, held genuine promise of deeper commitment, revealed, through Dorothy's own increasingly frustrated and eventually resigned tone across the collection's later letters, a pattern of Kessler repeatedly gently declining any deeper commitment that might have required him to explain the full nature of his ongoing, careful devotion to a family he had sworn himself to protect from a distance. "I understand," one of Dorothy's final letters read, dated some 8 years before Kessler's death, "that you carry some obligation you feel unable to fully explain to me, Walter, and I have tried, across these years of our acquaintance, to respect whatever privacy that obligation requires. But I cannot continue building a life around a partnership that always seems to hold something back, some careful reservation you will not fully share, however genuine your evident affection has otherwise proven across our years together. I wish you well, truly, but I cannot continue waiting for an explanation I am beginning to understand you may never be prepared to offer." Claire sat with this discovery for a long while, understanding, with a fresh wave of complicated grief, exactly how thoroughly Kessler's decades of guilt and devotion had reshaped not simply her own unknowing life, but his own considerable capacity for genuine personal happiness and connection. He had built, quite deliberately, an entire adult existence structured around a debt he could never fully repay, sacrificing, in the process, the kind of ordinary companionship and partnership that might otherwise have offered him genuine fulfillment across the many isolated years his careful mission had required. The journal's final entries, dated across the months immediately preceding Kessler's death, revealed a man who had, in his final years, apparently found some measure of peace with the particular shape his sacrifice had taken, even as the entry's increasingly reflective tone suggested a genuine reckoning with exactly what that sacrifice had ultimately cost him. "I do not regret the choices I have made," one of the final entries read, Kessler's handwriting grown noticeably less steady than the careful script of his earlier decades of writing. "I understand that I might have built a different life, had I chosen differently, a wife, perhaps children of my own, the kind of ordinary companionship that Dorothy and others across the years might have offered had I been willing to set aside the particular guilt that has shaped my entire adult existence. But I do not believe I could have lived with myself, choosing that ordinary happiness while your father's daughter faced the world without whatever quiet protection I was capable of providing. I made my choice many years ago, in the aftermath of watching your father give his life for mine, and I have found, across the years since, that whatever loneliness that choice ultimately required has been considerably eased by the quiet satisfaction of watching you build a life of genuine independence and accomplishment, even from the careful distance I never allowed myself to properly close." Claire closed the journal's final volume with tears she made no effort to suppress, understanding with a clarity that would take considerably longer than these few days at the cabin to fully process the full weight of what a stranger's decades of careful, invisible devotion had actually cost him, and what it had, in turn, provided for her own life, without her ever once knowing to be grateful for it. She stayed at the cabin for the better part of 2 weeks, working through the practical business of properly understanding, and eventually claiming the inheritance Kessler's will had left her. But finding herself, across those quiet weeks of solitary reflection, increasingly drawn to the particular peace the mountain property offered, a genuine sense of connection to a man she had never consciously met, but whose careful, decades-long presence in her life's shadows had shaped, she now understood, nearly every significant turning point of her adult existence. It was Patricia Vance, during one of their several careful follow-up conversations regarding the estate's formal transfer, who mentioned, almost in passing, that Kessler had maintained, across his final years, an occasional friendship with a nearby property owner named James Holloway, a fellow veteran who had apparently been one of the few people Kessler had permitted into even a modest degree of genuine friendship during his otherwise carefully isolated final decades. Claire sought out this connection during her second week at the cabin, driving the considerable distance to Holloway's own more modest mountain property, with a careful curiosity about whatever additional understanding of Kessler's character this friendship might provide, beyond what the journal's own careful, guilt-shaped perspective had offered. James Holloway, when she finally located him, proved to be a weathered man of perhaps 60, whose own military service had apparently provided the common ground for a friendship with Kessler that had spanned nearly a decade before the older man's death. "Walter talked about you," Holloway told her, once Claire had explained the circumstances of her visit, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of grief and recognition that suggested he had been genuinely fond of the man whose careful, isolated devotion Claire had spent the preceding 2 weeks working to properly understand. Not often, and never with any real detail, he held that particular obligation close, the way I understand a man carries the weight of a promise he considers sacred. But I could tell, across the years I knew him, that whatever quiet mission occupied his thoughts, it gave his life a purpose that I think mattered to him considerably more than any ordinary comfort he might otherwise have pursued. "Did he seem happy?" Claire asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple phrasing suggested. "Living the way he did? Alone, mostly? Carrying this obligation for so many years?" Holloway considered the question with evident care before answering. "I think," he said finally, "that Walter found a particular kind of peace in his later years, once enough time had passed that the guilt he carried had settled into something closer to quiet purpose than active pain. I don't believe he regretted the life he built, even if it wasn't the life most men might have chosen for themselves. He told me once, not long before he passed, that watching you build your own independent life from a careful distance had given him more genuine satisfaction than he believed any more conventional happiness could have provided. I think, in his own particular way, he considered his life well spent." Claire returned to the cabin that evening, carrying this fuller, considerably more peaceful understanding of the man whose careful decades of devotion had shaped her own unknowing life so completely, and made, over the following weeks, the decision that would ultimately reshape her own future in turn. Rather than selling the remote mountain property, as her initial practical instincts had first suggested, she would keep it, would learn, gradually and carefully, to make it genuinely her own, rather than simply an inherited monument to a stranger's guilt and sacrifice. She moved to the cabin permanently within the year, transitioning her career to remote work that the property's eventual internet installation made increasingly practical, and found herself, across the following seasons of gradually settling into a mountain life she had never anticipated for herself, developing a genuine connection to the careful, deliberate home Walter Kessler had built specifically with her welfare in mind. Understanding, in her quieter, reflective moments, that whatever complicated grief and gratitude this inheritance had first brought her, she had ultimately been given something considerably more valuable than mere property. A fuller understanding of her own father's sacrifice, and a stranger's decades of quiet, costly devotion that had, without her ever once knowing to be grateful for it, shaped nearly every significant turning point of the independent, accomplished life she had always believed she had built entirely on her own.